In March 1783, a London jury was asked a simple commercial question. Did the owners of a ship deserve £30 for every piece of cargo their crew had thrown into the sea? The cargo was 132 human beings. The jury said yes, pay the owners. Nobody in that courtroom was on trial for murder. To understand how that was possible, you have to follow a slave ship that missed an island. The ship was called the Zong. She had begun as a Dutch vessel, the Zorg. The word means care. Captured in wartime and sold to a syndicate of slave traders in Liverpool, then the busiest slave trading port in Europe. Her new owners, led by a merchant named William Gregson, ran her the way they ran every voyage, as an investment. In 1781, on the West African coast, the Zong took on 442 captive Africans, roughly twice as many people as a ship her size could safely carry. To the men who financed voyages like this, those 442 people were entries in a ledger. Each one was insured, like the timber and the rigging, at £30 a head. And buried in that paperwork was a distinction that would decide who lived. If enslaved people died of sickness, that was the owner's loss. The insurers owed nothing. But cargo deliberately thrown overboard to save the ship, what maritime law called jettison, that the insurers had to pay for. On September 6, 1781, the Zong left the island of São Tomé and turned west toward Jamaica, a British sugar colony that bought enslaved labor by the shipload. The crossing should have taken about 2 months. It went wrong almost at once. Disease moved through the packed, airless hold, and by late November, dozens of captives and several of the 17 crew were dead. The captain, Luke Collingwood, was a former ship surgeon on his first command, and he was gravely ill. His first mate had been suspended after a quarrel. Nobody was fully in charge. Then, in late November, the crew sighted Jamaica and decided it was the French island of Saint-Domingue. They kept sailing. By the time anyone understood the mistake, the Zong was 300 miles past her destination, beating back against the wind. Somewhere in those wasted miles, the arithmetic began. Water was rationed. Sick captives kept dying below deck. And every one of those deaths was money the owners would never see again. Then someone aboard proposed a solution drawn straight from the insurance policy. The surviving officers later blamed each other, and the ship's log conveniently disappeared, so no one knows for certain whose idea it was. But the logic was plain. People who died of sickness were worthless. People thrown into the sea to save the ship were worth £30 each. On November 29th, the crew forced 54 women and children through the cabin windows and into the Atlantic. 2 days later, 42 men went over the side. By the crew's own later testimony, it rained hard that day, hard enough to collect 6 casks of drinking water. The killings continued anyway. In the final group, 10 captives chose to jump rather than be handled. One man, the first mate later admitted, caught a rope in the darkness and climbed back aboard. In all, 132 people were murdered. The crew called it necessity. 3 weeks later, the Zong anchored at Black River, Jamaica, with 420 gallons of drinking water still aboard. The roughly 200 survivors were sold. Captain Collingwood died within days. And back in Liverpool, the owners did exactly what their ledger suggested. They filed an insurance claim for the 132 people their crew had killed. The insurers refused to pay. So in March 1783, the dispute went to court in London as an ordinary commercial case. Gregson versus Gilbert. Not murder, not manslaughter. A disagreement about cargo. The jury heard the water shortage story and sided with the owners. And it might have ended there, as a quiet payout between businessmen. Except that a formerly enslaved writer living in London heard about the case. His name was Olaudah Equiano, and he carried the story to Granville Sharp, a stubborn government clerk who had spent 15 years attacking slavery through the English courts. Sharp started building a murder case. That May, the insurers appealed before Lord Mansfield, the most powerful judge in England, with Sharp sitting in the courtroom, having the proceedings taken down word for word. Mansfield summed up the first trial in a sentence that has followed this case ever since. "The jury had no doubt," he said, "though it shocks one very much, that the case of the slaves was the same as if horses had been thrown overboard." But the owner's story was falling apart. There had been rain. There was water left. Mansfield threw out the verdict and ordered a new trial. As far as the records show, that trial never happened, and the owners never got their money. No one was ever prosecuted for the killings. Sharp refused to let the paperwork die. He sent his transcript and his letters to the Admiralty, to newspapers, to bishops, to anyone who would read them. The prosecution he wanted never came, but the file he built did something else. It turned a private insurance dispute into public evidence of what the slave trade actually was. Abolitionists retold the story for decades. Within a few years, Parliament capped how many people a slave ship could legally carry, and later shut the loophole itself, so that no owner could insure against people thrown into the sea. It still took until 1807 for Britain to abolish the slave trade entirely. In 1840, nearly 60 years after the killings, the painter J.M.W. Turner exhibited a canvas of a slave ship in a storm, the sea around it scattered with chains and drowning hands. Viewers knew the story it echoed. The Zong had refused to sink. And maybe that is the darkest thing about this case. The crew never hid what they did. They counted it, priced it at £30 a head, and asked an English court to approve it. And the first court did. The massacre survives in history not because anyone confessed, but because the killers filed the paperwork.